The day started like any other. The sun was high, casting a warm light on the quiet neighborhood as a father and his son walked down the sidewalk. The father, a man with a calm demeanor, had been through a lot in his life. He had learned how to be patient and measured, always thinking things through before acting. His son, on the other hand, was a young man with an easy smile and a quiet presence. He was well-mannered and kept to himself, living a life far from the public eye. They talked casually, laughing about the little things, how the father had to fix the car again, how the son had aced his exam, and the small plans they had for the evening. Life seemed peaceful, calm, and uneventful, as it usually was when they were together. But in the blink of an eye, that all changed. As they rounded the corner, two police officers were standing by their patrol car, observing the streets. They glanced at the father and son as they approached, and without any apparent reason, one of the officers signaled for them to stop. The father, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, calmly slowed down and looked at his son, giving him a silent signal to stay composed. They were used to walking through the neighborhood, and they had never been stopped before. "Is there a problem, officer?" the father asked, his voice steady. "We just need to check your ID," the officer responded, not sounding unfriendly but firm, his hand resting near his holster. The father was momentarily confused. He hadn't done anything wrong, and neither had his son. They were just out for a walk. But the officer's tone made it clear they weren't just making small talk. "Why do you need to check our ID?" the father asked again, this time with a hint of concern creeping into his voice. He didn't want to make the situation more tense, but something about the way the officer spoke made him uneasy. The second officer, standing a little further back, started to move closer, scanning the son with a sharp look. It was almost as if he was sizing him up. The son didn't react, his face remaining calm and collected. He had always been good at staying level-headed, never showing too much emotion, even when he was nervous. "Just routine," the first officer said. "Step over here, both of you." There was no room for negotiation in his voice. The father felt a knot tighten in his stomach, but he didn't argue. He simply nodded and motioned for his son to follow him, his mind racing as he tried to understand why they were being stopped in the first place. The father could feel the tension rising between them and the officers. Something was off. It wasn't the first time he had seen this kind of interaction, but it was the first time he felt as if his family was being unfairly targeted. The air felt thick, heavy with anticipation, and in that moment, the father knew they were about to face something they didn't expect. He only hoped it wouldn't escalate. Without warning, the officer's voice grew louder, and the tension reached a breaking point. "We told you to step aside," the officer barked. His hand shot out to grab the son's arm, and before anyone could process what was happening, the son was thrown to the ground with a sudden, violent motion. The father's heart skipped a beat. His son had barely reacted, almost as if he expected it, but the father knew he had to act quickly. The moment his son hit the ground, the father's heart raced. Time seemed to slow down as he watched the officers struggle to pin the young man down. His son remained calm, not resisting but not complying either. It was like watching someone who knew exactly what to do, but chose not to engage in the chaos around them. The father's thoughts scrambled. He wasn't sure whether to step in or wait, but his protective instincts kicked in. He knew he had to do something before things got even worse. "Stop," the father called out, his voice loud but steady. He stepped forward, trying to place himself between his son and the officers. His mind was racing, trying to figure out what had caused this sudden eruption of tension. The officers were trained to handle situations like this, but something about the whole interaction didn't feel right. They weren't just dealing with a typical street incident. The father had seen enough of these interactions to know when things were escalating for no reason. The first officer, his hand still gripping the son's arm, looked up at the father, his face hard and unblinking. "Stay back," the officer ordered, his voice tense, though not outright threatening. But the father could sense the officer's discomfort. The uncertainty in his eyes, the slight hesitation in his movements. It was a brief moment, but the father noticed it. The officer was beginning to realize they had made a mistake. But the situation was far from settled. The second officer, who had been standing at a distance, now moved in closer, his eyes narrowing as he observed the son more carefully. The son didn't look frightened or angry, just calm, as though this was just another part of his life, something he had dealt with countless times before. But the officers didn't know that. They couldn't see beyond the young man's quiet demeanor. "Sir, we need to make sure you're not carrying anything dangerous," the second officer said, his tone now slightly softer, as if trying to justify his actions. The father, frustrated and confused, tried to step closer, but the officers' postures made it clear they weren't about to back down just yet. The whole scene felt like a misunderstanding, one that could have been avoided if the officers had taken a second to think before reacting. "Why are you treating him like this?" the father asked, his voice rising with both confusion and anger. He couldn't help it. He didn't understand why they were doing this to his son. He was just a young man walking through his neighborhood. There was no reason for this kind of treatment. The father knew his son. He knew he wasn't a threat. He wasn't sure how to explain it, but there was something in his gut telling him that this wasn't just about an ID check. This was something deeper. The officers exchanged a quick look, and for a brief moment, it seemed like they were reconsidering their approach. But before anything could change, the father did what he had to do. He spoke up, not just as a father trying to protect his son, but as someone who had seen enough of these situations to know how to handle the pressure. He took a deep breath, his voice steady but firm. "Let him go. Now." The officers paused for a moment, uncertainty flashing in their eyes. The father's command had carried weight, not because of his size or appearance, but because of the authority in his voice. It was the calmness, the confidence, the steady resolve that made them hesitate. But despite the pause, they didn't immediately release the son. The second officer, still holding a tight grip on the son's arm, seemed to be searching for something in the young man's expression, a sign that he was somehow a threat. Yet there was nothing but a quiet resolve on the son's face, as if he was waiting for the storm to pass. "Listen," the father said again, his voice quieter, but just as firm. "This isn't the way to do things. My son is not a criminal, and he's not going to fight you. Just let him go." The first officer, who had been standing back a little, glanced at his partner. His eyes narrowed as if he were trying to piece things together. Something didn't feel right to him. He had seen countless encounters, but this one felt different. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there was a quiet strength in the son's demeanor that unsettled him. The father, too, seemed like he wasn't the typical concerned parent. There was something about his calmness, his lack of panic, that made the officer wonder if they had made a terrible mistake. The second officer finally let go of the son's arm, but his posture remained tense. He took a small step back, unsure of what to do next. The father watched him carefully, knowing this was the moment when things could either spiral out of control or start to de-escalate. The son, still on the ground, slowly pushed himself up, brushing off his clothes as if nothing had happened. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, and the way he stood, straightening his back, gave off an air of quiet authority. But the officers didn't understand. To them, he was just another young man, caught in a misunderstanding. What they didn't know was that the son wasn't just any young man. He was a trained professional, a commander with a background that made him one of the most dangerous people they could have ever encountered, if it came to that. The father stood beside him now, his eyes locked on the officers. He could sense the uncertainty in the air. He knew what had to come next, but he wasn't sure if the officers were ready to face the truth. His son was no ordinary person, and if they knew what he was capable of, this entire encounter would have taken a different turn. There was an uncomfortable silence, the kind that settled deep in your bones when no one quite knew how to move forward. The father took a deep breath, trying to keep his emotions in check. He wasn't angry anymore. He was just tired. Tired of the way things had been. tired of the way people judged his son based on nothing more than assumptions and appearances. He wanted to make it clear that his son wasn't someone to be handled with force, not someone to be feared. He was a man who had earned every ounce of respect in his life, not through intimidation, but through hard work and dedication. "He's not the one you need to be worried about," the father finally said, his voice steady. "But if you keep pushing, you'll regret it." The officers stood frozen, their minds racing as they tried to process the implications of the father's words. They had just realized that they had crossed a line, but they still didn't understand how deep that line went. The son was not someone they could intimidate or control. And soon, they would find out just how true that was. The tension in the air was thick, almost unbearable. The officers stood there, staring at the father and son, the weight of the father's words slowly sinking in. The first officer cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation, though his hands were still shaking slightly. He wasn't sure what to make of the father's statement. It didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like a promise that something much bigger was at play. The son, still standing with his back straight and his gaze calm, didn't offer any explanation. His silence spoke volumes. It wasn't arrogance. It was quiet confidence, the kind that came only from experience. But the officers, caught in the midst of their own confusion and assumptions, still didn't understand. They didn't know who the young man before them truly was. The father's words echoed in the air, hanging between them like a challenge. The officers didn't know how to respond. They had underestimated the situation from the very beginning. Now, they were caught in their mistake, unsure whether to back off or press forward. "Sir," the first officer finally said, his voice unsure, "we're just trying to do our job here." He sounded tired now, less defensive than before. The words seemed empty, as if the officer himself wasn't sure why he had taken such aggressive steps in the first place. The father sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. He knew the officer wasn't the one at fault. He was just another person caught up in a system that often made mistakes, that didn't always see people for who they truly were. The father had lived a life filled with lessons, many of them hard-earned, and he had seen how quickly people judged others without knowing the full story. "I understand," the father replied, his voice softer now. "But you don't understand what you're dealing with. My son isn't like anyone you've met before." There was a long pause before the second officer spoke. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. "What makes him so different?" The father looked at his son, his eyes filled with pride and concern. He had kept his son's past hidden for so long, believing that a life of quiet peace would be enough for them both. But now, as the situation escalated, he realized that hiding the truth was no longer an option. With a steady breath, the father turned back to the officers. "My son," he began, his voice calm but firm, "is one of the most skilled men in the world. He's been trained in ways you can't imagine. He's a leader in a unit that most people only hear about in whispers. He's not someone you want to treat this way." The officers blinked, stunned into silence. They had no idea what to make of the revelation. The second officer's hand twitched slightly, almost as if he were about to reach for his radio, but something held him back. He could sense the truth in the father's words, even if he didn't fully understand what they meant. For a moment, the air was still. The father's words hung heavily in the silence. The son, still standing with his calm composure, looked at the officers with a quiet intensity. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to send a message. "We didn't know," the first officer said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't know who we were dealing with." The father nodded, understanding the gravity of their realization. "No one ever does," he said quietly. "And that's the problem." The son stepped forward, moving slowly, deliberately. He wasn't in a hurry. There was no need for haste. He knew that his calm presence had already done its job. It had made the officers see that they were in the wrong. It wasn't about strength or power. It was about control, about knowing when to act and when to remain still. As the officers backed away, still processing the weight of the father's words, the father placed a hand gently on his son's shoulder. The quiet moment between them spoke volumes. No words were needed. They had faced a moment of tension, but they had survived it together. And for the first time in a long time, the father felt a sense of peace knowing that his son was not just any man. He was someone who could hold his ground, someone who was ready for anything life threw his way. The silence between the father and the officers lingered, thick with unspoken thoughts. As the officers stepped back, still processing what the father had just revealed, the father turned to his son. His gaze softened as he looked at him, pride and a little worry crossing his features. His son had always been different, quiet, controlled, a natural leader. He had never spoken much about his past, preferring to let it stay in the shadows, far from the prying eyes of the world. The father had respected that. But now, in this moment, the truth couldn't stay hidden any longer. The officers, still stunned, exchanged glances, not quite sure how to respond. They had seen a lot in their careers, but nothing had prepared them for this. They hadn't expected the calm young man they had thrown to the ground to be someone with such a powerful background. There had been no indication in his demeanor, no sign that he was anything other than an ordinary young man going about his day. One of the officers cleared his throat, his eyes still wide with disbelief. "So, you're saying he's a military commander?" The question hung in the air, still disbelieving, as if he couldn't quite grasp the reality of what the father had just said. The father nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on his son. "Yes, a commander in one of the most elite units in the world, Delta Force. He's been part of operations you could only imagine in your worst nightmares. He's not someone you want to underestimate." His voice was firm, but there was an unmistakable sadness behind it. He had seen the toll that the life his son led had taken on him, the years of danger and secrecy, the burden of a job that most people could never fathom. The father had always wished his son could have a quieter life, but it seemed the world had other plans. The officers, realizing the gravity of the situation, seemed to shrink under the weight of their own misunderstanding. They had treated this encounter as just another routine check, never imagining that the young man they had forced to the ground was someone whose skills could outmatch their own in an instant. The second officer spoke up, his voice quieter now, filled with a sense of humility. "We had no idea. We thought he was just another guy." His words trailed off, his face flushed with embarrassment. He could feel the sting of his own judgment, the assumption that he had been dealing with just another civilian. But now, after hearing the father's words and seeing the unshakable calm in the son's eyes, the truth was clear. The father sighed, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. "You don't know what it's like," he said quietly. "You don't know what it's like to have to hide who your child really is, to watch them live a life full of danger, never knowing if they'll make it back home. It's a burden I've carried for years, keeping his identity a secret for his safety. And now I have to wonder if that was enough." The son didn't say anything. He just stood there, his face unreadable. He had never wanted to be defined by his past, by his training, by the things he had done in the name of duty. He had always preferred to live a quiet life, away from the eyes of the world, away from the recognition and the admiration that often came with his role. But life didn't always give him that choice. The officers stood in silence, not sure how to respond to the father's words. They had been so quick to judge, so quick to escalate the situation. But now they understood the depth of their mistake. The father wasn't just speaking from a place of anger or frustration. He was speaking from a place of love and protection. He had kept his son's identity hidden for so long, hoping to shield him from the dangers of the world. But now, in the face of this confrontation, it had all come crashing down. One of the officers finally spoke, his voice tentative. We didn't mean to disrespect you or your son. We're sorry for what happened." His words were genuine, but they still felt empty, like an apology that could never undo the damage they had caused. The father nodded, though he didn't feel the need to forgive them. The moment had passed, and the damage had been done. He just wanted to move on, to return to the quiet life they had once known. But deep down, he knew it would never be the same. Their world had changed, and they would never be able to go back to the way things were before. The truth had been revealed, and there was no hiding it now. As the officers slowly backed away, the father and son stood there, in the quiet aftermath of the confrontation. The father placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a silent gesture of support and understanding. They didn't need to say anything. They both knew that, for better or worse, the truth was now out in the open. And whatever came next, they would face it together. The father stood quietly as the officers slowly retreated, their faces still holding a mix of confusion and guilt. The air was thick with the weight of what had just happened, but the father didn't feel any satisfaction in seeing the officers step back. There was no victory in it, only the realization that once again they had been judged by assumptions and appearances. This time, though, the truth had come to light in a way none of them had expected. As the officers got into their patrol car and drove away, the father turned to his son, his eyes searching his face. His son hadn't said a word throughout the entire confrontation. There was no anger, no frustration, just a quiet calm. It was almost as if he had expected this moment, as though it was just another part of the life he had lived. The father didn't know what his son was thinking, but he knew that this was not the first time something like this had happened. His son had faced judgment before, faced misunderstandings, and even worse, but he never let it show. "You all right?" the father finally asked, his voice soft and uncertain. The son glanced at him, his face unreadable for a moment before he gave a slight nod. "I'm fine," he said simply. His voice was steady, as if nothing had happened. He wasn't looking for sympathy, and he wasn't trying to deflect the gravity of the situation. He just wanted to move on, just as he always had. The father, however, couldn't shake the heaviness in his chest. He had spent years trying to shield his son from the harsh realities of the world, from the dangers that came with being part of something so secretive, so high stakes. He had always wanted to keep his son's identity hidden, to give him the chance at a normal life, away from the risks and the sacrifices that came with being in Delta Force. But now, in one moment, all of that had changed. The truth was out. The world now knew that the quiet young man walking beside him was not just another college student or an average citizen. He was a decorated military commander, someone whose name carried weight in places most people would never hear about. The father wasn't sure if that made him proud or worried. He was proud of his son's accomplishments, of everything he had done to protect others. But he also feared the consequences of the truth being known. There was no going back. People would look at his son differently now, whether they understood his background or not. The father took a deep breath and glanced around the street. The quiet neighborhood, the calm afternoon, nothing had changed in the world around them. But everything had changed for them. He looked back at his son. "You've kept this hidden for so long. I've always respected that, but now it's out there. You're not just a kid anymore, are you?" The son met his gaze, and for the first time, a hint of something flickered in his eyes, something softer, more vulnerable. "I never wanted to be," he said quietly. "I didn't want to be known for this. I wanted to live like everyone else. But sometimes, you don't get a choice." The father nodded, understanding. It wasn't just about the family's safety anymore. It was about the sacrifices his son had made, the life he had led without anyone ever knowing the full story. For years, he had tried to protect his son from the dangers of being in such an elite, secretive unit, but in truth, it wasn't something that could ever be hidden forever. The world was too small, too connected. "You've done a good job, son," the father said after a long pause. "More than I ever could. But it's not fair, is it, that you've had to keep all of this to yourself?" The son shook his head, a faint smile touching his lips. "It's not about fairness, Dad. It's just how things are. People will always see what they want to see, but I've learned that I don't need to prove anything to them. The father stood there for a moment, taking in the words. His son wasn't just talking about the police officers. He was talking about the world in general, the way people judged others based on their appearances, based on assumptions. It was a harsh truth, but one that his son had learned to accept long ago. He didn't need anyone else's approval. He had earned his place, and that was all that mattered to him. The father finally let out a deep breath and clapped his son on the back. I guess we'll have to figure out what happens next. No going back now. The son nodded. No, but whatever happens, we'll face it together. We've always done that. And with that, the father finally felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from pretending everything was fine. It was the kind of peace that came from understanding, from accepting the truth. They had made it through this confrontation, and whatever else lay ahead, they would face it as a family. The father and son stood together for a moment, the sounds of the quiet neighborhood returning to them. The distant hum of traffic, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, and the soft chirping of birds all felt so distant, almost surreal in comparison to the tension they had just experienced. It was as if the world had moved on, yet they were stuck in this small bubble of realization. They had made it through the confrontation, but it wasn't over, not by a long shot. As they walked down the sidewalk, side by side, the father couldn't help but notice how much had changed in such a short amount of time. His son, always the quiet, unassuming figure, had just been thrust into the spotlight, his identity exposed in a way neither of them had ever anticipated. The world they had known, one of peace and quiet, free from the scrutiny of others, was no longer theirs. The truth was out now, and there would be consequences. They continued walking, the father's mind racing with thoughts of what would happen next. He had never wanted this life for his son. He had always hoped that his child could live a life away from the dangers, away from the high stakes and constant tension that came with being in the military. The life of a soldier, especially one in a unit as elite as Delta Force, wasn't a life most people could even comprehend. It was filled with secrecy, danger, and moments that couldn't be shared with anyone, not even family. But now, as the realization sank in, the father understood that he had been holding on to an illusion. No matter how hard they tried to keep his son's identity hidden, there were always going to be moments like this, moments where the past caught up with them. He couldn't protect his son from the world forever. And maybe, just maybe, his son didn't want that protection. What do you think will happen now? The father finally asked, his voice steady but tinged with concern. His son thought for a moment before answering. I don't know. People will talk. They'll make assumptions. Some will look at me differently, maybe with fear, maybe with respect. But none of it matters, Dad. What matters is what I do next. The father glanced at his son, taking in the strength in his words, the quiet resolve. It was clear that his son had already come to terms with the realities of the situation. While the father had been trying to protect him from it all, his son had been preparing himself for it. You've always been like that, the father said softly. Always so calm, so sure of yourself. I never understood how you could be so sure when the world around you is always changing. The son smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth lifting just a little. I've learned to trust myself, Dad. I've been through enough to know that I can handle whatever comes next. It's not about being certain. It's about knowing that you can handle the uncertainty. The father nodded slowly, feeling a mixture of pride and sadness. He had always admired his son's strength and resilience. But today, seeing it all come to light, he couldn't help but feel a pang of sorrow for the life his son had lived. It wasn't a life of normalcy. It wasn't a life of peace. But it had shaped him into someone who could navigate any challenge, any obstacle with quiet confidence. They reached the corner of the street where the father had parked the car. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. It was almost as if the world was moving into a new phase, a new chapter. And just like the world around them, the father and son were stepping into a new reality. You know, we'll have to figure out how to handle things from here on out, the father said, his voice thoughtful. People will start asking questions. The truth will spread. The son nodded, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. I know, but I'm ready for it. Whatever comes next, we'll deal with it. The father watched his son for a moment, taking in the calm, collected demeanor that had always been a part of him. He had always thought that his son had the weight of the world on his shoulders, but now, looking at him, he realized that his son had always carried that weight with grace. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for the father to step back and trust that his son was more than capable of handling whatever came his way. As they got into the car and drove off, the father couldn't shake the feeling that things had changed forever. The world would see his son in a new light, and while that might bring new challenges, the father knew one thing for sure. His son was ready for whatever came next. As the car rolled down the road, the evening sky turning a soft shade of orange, the father and son drove in a comfortable silence. There was no need for words. The weight of the moment hung between them, and they both understood that life had irrevocably shifted. The quiet of the drive was different now, calmer, yet filled with a certain unspoken tension. They weren't the same people who had left the house that morning, and the world they were heading back to wouldn't be the same either. The father's thoughts drifted to the future. It wasn't just the officers who had misunderstood today, it was everyone. They had spent so much time trying to protect themselves, trying to create a life that was untouched by the shadows of his son's past. But the truth always had a way of coming out, didn't it? The question was no longer about hiding it, but about how to move forward from here. After a long moment, the father broke the silence. "You're right, he said quietly, his voice a little softer now. "It's not about certainty or knowing the next step. It's about trusting that you can face whatever comes, even when it's all unknown." He glanced over at his son, who was sitting quietly in the passenger seat, staring out the window. The calmness in his son's posture made the father feel both proud and protective, as though the young man sitting beside him could face anything. Anything but the one thing his father wished he could change: the constant danger his son lived with. "Does it ever get exhausting?" the father asked. "Carrying all of that weight, I mean." The son turned his head to look at his father, his expression soft, though his eyes held a quiet wisdom. "Sometimes," he said after a pause, "but I've learned to accept it. It's part of who I am. It doesn't go away. But I know that it's something I can handle. I don't need to be free of it. I just need to be strong enough to carry it." The father's heart tightened a little. His son's words were the truth, the kind of truth that only someone who had seen the world through a lens of responsibility, of hard-earned experience, could understand. The weight of his past, of his training, would never disappear, and as much as the father wished for a simpler, safer life for him, he knew that his son had already accepted this reality, and in that acceptance, his son had found a kind of peace. They turned onto their street, the familiar homes and yards stretching out before them, almost as if nothing had changed. But in the quiet, in the subtle shift in the air, the father knew that they were no longer the same. There would be people who would look at his son differently now. They would ask questions, dig deeper, make assumptions. The secrecy that had kept them safe for so long was gone. The truth had been exposed, and there was no taking it back. As they pulled into the driveway, the father put the car in park and sat there for a moment, staring ahead. The house in front of them was the same, but it wasn't. It wasn't just a place of safety anymore. It was a place that held a secret, a place that would never be the same again. His son, the one who had always lived in the shadows of his past, was now standing in the light. The father glanced over at his son. "You've done more for this country, for people you'll never meet, than most people will ever know," he said quietly. "And you did it all without asking for anything in return. I think that's something most people will never truly understand." The son's lips curved slightly into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I don't need them to understand," he said softly. "I only need to know that what I've done matters. To me. To the people I care about. That's enough." The father nodded, a sense of peace washing over him despite the uncertainty that lay ahead. There would be challenges, no doubt. The world would now see his son for what he truly was, more than just a quiet young man, more than just a member of their family. But he would always be his son, the one who had learned to bear the weight of the world with quiet strength, the one who had faced the impossible and walked through it without flinching. Together, they stepped out of the car, the evening air cool against their skin. As they walked toward the front door, the father couldn't help but feel a quiet pride settle in his chest. His son had faced the most difficult truth anyone could, and he had done it with grace and courage. Whatever the future held, the father knew they would face it together, with the same quiet strength that had always been a part of their lives.